All right, recording in progress. I'm going to share my screen. And wow, there's a lot of zoom on my screen right now. Okay, so hopefully you guys can see this. And suddenly my rendered mode works. I don't know why. All right. So anyway, this is me just right before class putting together all the components that we drew last week. Throwing something together here. I started making this sort of weird volume on the top. Realized that I could line these things up and sort of create some sort of axis. I can have a path running through it. Then somehow I started making a mess underneath, but sort of catty corner. And then where they intersected, some weird stuff happens. And I thought maybe that could be some sort of, potentially if I started to trim things out, maybe some sort of vertical circulation spine of some sort, right? So really just speculative right now, just sort of moving some planes around. I even sort of stretched a few planes just to make some things line up. I couldn't resist the architect in me, like it drove me crazy that I couldn't get these gaps to line up. So I made them line up. So really quickly, again, just as a refresher, right? There's a number of different ways I could move these things in space. You guys have probably been encountering these sort of ideas or these different ways, different workflows. I could use the rotate tool, and then snap and then rotate this 90 degrees. So I'll type that in. Center of rotation, angle or first reference point, right? And then I could, snap, or I could enter in an actual angle if I wanted to, like 90 degrees. You can see I have gumball turned on down here. So grid snap, ortho, planar, O snap, smart stack gumball, right? I turn these on and off as I need. In this case, I've turned gumball on and off, and that gives me these handles for moving things in the XYZ axis, rotating them in the XYZ axis, and then scaling them in the XYZ axes. And so if I select one of these, I can then turn it. I have ortho on, so it only turns in 90-degree increments. If I turn ortho off, you can see I can sort of freehand it. Or if I just simply click on the right rotate handle, it'll give me a field and I can type in 90 degrees and boom, there's 90-degree rotation. Right, it did it around the centroid of the volume. And so in order then to move this in the right place, I would need to snap to endpoint, snap to endpoint, and put it in place, right? If I wanted to rotate that thing around. All right, so really quickly, just wanted to sort of point these things out. In this, of course, I'm just going to move these over here since my layers, they're in the way of my layers here. These fit within a 60 by 60 cube that I modeled and turned on. Let me just turn this to ghosted. There we go. And so you can see that, right? So I turn this on and everything sort of fits inside. I can turn that back off. All right. So really quickly, we talked a little bit about Make 2D last week, right? Which makes a flattened two-dimensional drawing. In this case, and we were thinking about isometrics, but it gives you all the lines and curves, and you can bring those into Illustrator as vector line work, and you can begin to adjust line weights here and there, right? And that's a useful workflow, and we'll do that from time to time when we need to. But I will say it's not foolproof, and sometimes you have to go back through and audit that drawing and see where it missed lines or didn't have things quite line up. A better way of doing this when it comes to a lot of line work, or if you just want to do something quickly, right, is to then, what we do is we look at some of these display modes and we start to modify them and make them work for us instead of the other way around, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you quickly in both Rhino and then in the Windows OS and then Mac OS, how you can begin to adjust these. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you rendered, right, which we saw, sort of white clay model with some soft shadows, right? The sort of default render mode. And technical, which is this sort of hand drafted look, right, with hidden lines and things like that. And we're going to blend those two things together and then set some of these settings the way we want, right? All right, so Windows side first. Since I have that up. And I'm going to go to Tools, pull down menu, Options, right? All of our settings in Rhino and on the Windows side are in Tools, pull down, Options, at least all the ones that I typically use. That brings up a box. On the left-hand side, you can see there's a whole number of, there's a real list here of stuff you can begin to tweak. Grid, colors, appearance. Colors are, I think, under appearance. So if you want to change your background color, what things look like when they're selected, etc., you can. But if I go all the way down to the bottom, view, right? And so we have display modes for our viewports, right? You'll see that we have the wireframe shaded, rendered, ghosted, X-ray, technical, artistic, pen, Arctic, ray trace that we have as options in our viewport when we go to the label and we set out how we want to see our objects in the viewport, right? When I go to display modes, so I'm not selecting any of these specifically, but I'm out here up in display modes. You'll see all of these things listed, and then you'll see new, import, export. So we can import display modes from other people, or we can download them off the internet and install them here. We can select one, like let's say I'm gonna go ahead and do this now. I'm gonna say technical. I'm gonna make a copy of it. All right. And now we have everything that was in technical. We have a new one called copy of technical. You can see it down here. And I'm just gonna say example from Tuesday, delete me later. That way I know what this is and I can just delete it away later. Okay. All right. So that way we don't have to mess around with the technical group. We can make our own and then play around with it. All right. So first and foremost, we know the technical gives us lines for edges, lines for intersections, dashed lines for hidden lines. So one of the things I'm going to do really quickly is I'm just going to hit OK. I'm going to set my perspective view from technical to this new one that we made, example from Tuesday, delete me later. Okay. And that way, as we start to change the settings, we can look at my viewport, and we can sort of view what the settings are doing, right, as we toggle things on and off. All right, so I just wanted to make sure I set my viewport to that new display mode. Go to options, find the display mode. Now let's start playing around with it, changing some things. And so one of the first things I'm going to do before I get too deep in the grid here, let me just make this a little larger so we can see. All right, is I'm going to leave this stuff on. So let's see, background. Instead of use application settings, I'm going to turn this to solid color. And I don't want gray, I want white. So I'm going for black line work on a white background. Ground plane settings, I'm going to leave that on and leave shadow only. Shading settings, I'm going to say shade objects. Okay, it's going to give me some flat shading to start off with. For color, material, and usage, instead of saying objects color, like the layer color, I'm going to say whatever rendering material that we have set. And that way later on, if we set some sort of shaders and materials to this, then it'll display those in our technical copy, right? So I did this before class, and I said A7067 copy of technical. So that's the one I'll be using from here on out when I work on these axons and ISOs and perspectives with you. Shading effects, I'll just leave that as standard shading. Then down here at the very, very bottom, I'm not going to really change much here. I'm just going to turn on use advanced GPU lighting if it's not turned on yet. Okay. Things are going to get a little lighter. All right, grid. I'm going to leave all of these the same as they are. I'm going to go to shadows. I'm going to turn shadows on. All right, now we're starting to get those soft shadows, just like with the render mode. But we also have the line work from technical mode, right? So it's nice. So I'm just going to click that up at the top for shadows, right? I'm just going through some of these settings. Other settings, I'm not going to play around with any of this stuff. I'll just leave them the same. But I'm going to go back to objects. You can see that there's a caret here. I can drill down into objects, and there's several different types of objects, and see how we can modify these things, right? So here, I don't think I'm going to change anything. I go to points. I'm just going to leave that the way it is. Curves, again, I think I'm just going to leave that the way it is. Lines. Now, this is a really good one because I like technical because it gives me all the settings that I want to really play around with. I have hidden lines, I have edge lines, I have intersection lines, and I have silhouette lines. So right here, I can begin to change everything around. Hidden line color usage. I can say use a single color for all hidden lines. It defaults to black. I'm just going to set that to be a little lighter. They're already by default turned to dashed lines. I'm just going to leave those really light. I like seeing them, but I don't necessarily like to see a lot of them, right? Like they're just there, and they're really subtle. Edge line color usage. In my case, I'm just going to say use single color. That way, if I'm using layers and some are violet layers and some are blue layers and some are green layers, they're going to default back to black, right? I just want a nice black and white line drawing, which I think is really quite lovely. For edge lines, I'm just going to beef them up a little bit. I'm going to say 2. Just make them a little thicker. Silhouette lines. Again, I'm just going to say use single color, use black. Beef those up a bit. So maybe like 4. And then there's section line color. I wanted those to be the same as the edge, so I'll put those as. Let's see what happens if I put it at 0. Does anything actually disappear? No. So I'll bump those up to 2. All right. Maybe I'll go back to this gray, just adjust it upwards a little bit. All right. Just make it a little crisper looking. And maybe you like 2 and 4. Maybe you want 1. And like, let's say 3, just so we can see a clear differentiation with the silhouettes from the edges and you know, but that's kind of up to you. But at this point, I've sort of changed all these things. I'm going to hit OK. All right. And now from here, it's just a matter of me turning this to isometric, figuring out which one I like the best. There's the Northeast. You know, I was talking about this cutouts and sort of some sort of axial relationship here where these two sort of volumes combine, where all the weird stuff happens and we start subtracting and blowing things around and rotating them out. So maybe I'll try to rotate this around a bit so we can actually see that. Maybe there. Yeah, why not? I'll set it there, right? And at this point, you can see that I'd want to clean up some of these intersections and things like that, right? But for the most part, I can sort of see these things. The way this happens, and I can sort of see some indoor-outdoor relationships. I can see one space bleeding into the other space. I can see basically a composition of planes. I start to understand maybe where there's some key thresholds. You know, as I start to look around this thing. One thing you'll notice is that in isometric mode, it looks really terrible, this horizon line, based off of the sort of infinite ground plane. So one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go back out the top view. I'm going to zoom out a bit. I'm going to make a planar surface. I'm going to go to my surface tools, click and hold. And just do one where I can make a planar surface, rectangular surface from corner to corner and draw that in. By default, it'll be the same white clay material. And just get rid of that silly silhouette, or sorry, the horizon line that was there, right? So this is an isometric, it's a paraline drawing. And if I'm ready to bring this out, oops, sorry, not there. I can go to view, pull down capture to file, right? And it's asking me which viewport do I want to capture. In this case, I'm going to make sure it's set to parallel. I can say transparent background. Right now, I just have the ground showing, so there's no background. If I want to get rid of the background and the ground plane, then I could, and then I'd have a transparent background. For scale, I'll just say 1:1. Now it's telling me the size of the viewport, 3160 by 1687 is going to be the size of this thing. And I'm fine with that. I'm going to hit OK. And last it's going to ask me where it wants to save. And look at that, I can actually save things to my Mac desktop now, which I can appreciate. And also the type of file. Do I want a JPEG or a PNG or a TIFF? You might have some preferences here, you might not. If you don't, I'll tell you JPEG is pretty standard format, but it's going to flatten things out. So you'll lose a little, it's called a lossy format. You lose a little bit of detail. You typically don't notice it, but it's all about how it compresses things to make things smaller or more, the file size more optimal. for the internet. You'll lose any transparency or alpha channels that you have. PNG and TIFF preserve alpha channels. PNG is usually a little tighter of a file format, a little less heavy. TIFF is the heaviest, right? So anyway, I'll just select PNG. Why not? I'll try to get in the habit of doing that. I can, of course, change the file name to, like, let's say ISO 01 or Axon 01 and hit OK, right? Now, it might take it a minute. Yeah, and then at the end here, let me just show you the command line. Command line is always going to tell you what it's doing. View capture to file. Okay, so it looks like it's done now. All right. And indeed, if I go to Windows, let's see here, ISO 01.png, there it is, right? Ta-da. All right, really quickly, let me just open up Rhino on the Mac side and just show for anybody. I think, Dina, you were on the Mac side. I'm not sure who else is at this point. Nate, are you still on the Mac side? No, you're on the Windows? Okay. But I did want to sort of show this. You'll find that the settings are pretty much the same. It's they're just in a different place. They look slightly different. I assume it's opening. Come on. Oh, sorry, that was showing the Windows version. Here we go. Here's the Mac version. Dun, 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 dun. I'll just say new model. Oh, yeah, I have to do that. New model. Here we go. All right. I'll just say it's usually pretty light. I don't understand what's taking so long. So in perspective view, I'm just going to model a couple of things here just so we can see them and cast some shadows. So right click, I'll go down to rendered. All right, that looks about right. And so I'm just going to go to Rhino pull down to the settings. And then you'll see not all your settings are going to be here that you would in the sort of tools pull down in the Windows side, but display modes are definitely here, right? Okay, and so I have wireframe, shaded, rendered, ghosted, X-ray, technical, artistic, pen, Arctic, and ray traced. I can do a custom one. So let's go technical. Let's see if I can export technical display mode. Let's see if I can just start a new one. Technical copy, right? So I just select a technical, and then I hit the plus sign down here. Got technical copy. Forgive me if you've already done this, but I'm just going to go to general and change the same things, right? So color material, I'm going to say rendering material. Technical copy, use front face settings, standard shading. So shading effects, I'm going to say standard shading. For scene lighting, I'm going to say advanced GPU lighting. Grid, I'm going to leave the same. Shadows, I'm going to make sure those are turned on. I'm not going to really mess with anything else here. Same with the other tab. I'll just leave that. Now going into objects, here we get into the all the stuff that we talked about before. I'll just leave curve and points and all that other stuff alone. I'm going to go down to lines. Here you can see hid line, edge line, silhouette line, intersection line. So in this case, I'm going to say use single color for all hid lines, for all edges, for all silhouettes. Intersection line, same thing. And then I'll change their line width or weight, right? So in this case, I'll do hidden line 1, edge line 2, 5, and 2, or something like that. All right. Go ahead and hit OK. And then I'll just double click over here and I'll turn this to technical copy, and you can see I have the same thing, right? All right. Which makes me super happy. And my shift key now works on my keyboard in Rhino, which is always a good thing. All right, you can see that there's this beefy silhouette of 5 points, 2 points for the intersections and edges, and then 1 point width for those dashed hidden lines, right? You can see those edges beyond. I like having all that information. You know, it's sort of, when I think about a drawing, I think about it as a database of information, right? Some of that stuff can be really useful. Other times I don't necessarily need it right away, but I can always put them on a layer and turn them on or off, just like layers of trace. Sometimes that information is interesting to see. You can start to see alignments or misalignments when you see all those construction lines and hidden lines and things like that. So the process is something that I always like to sort of see parts of the process revealed, whether we're doing this with pencil and paper or with an X-Acto knife and foam core. or with Rhino and a mouse. All right. So I'm always really interested in sort of seeing this line work and trying to understand how it goes. All right. So I'll go ahead and delete, or sorry, just go ahead and turn that off. I'm going to go back to Windows, right? So that's how we can do some ISOs. And I could go around. I could say, well, maybe I don't want to just pick one view. Maybe I'll pick several different views walking around this thing. You can see that it zoomed way out to fill this. Oh, sorry. I have to try to remember which way the mouse goes here. In Windows, it's different than in the Mac for some reason. Annoyingly. I guess I could probably change that if I wanted to, if I really cared that much, but I don't. It just load a new Windows update and erase my setting change anyway soon. All right, so maybe I want one from this direction as well, right? So again, thinking about how to publish these isometric drawings, these axon met drawings. In this case, by default, Rhino puts them at 30-30. And so that's what I want. I want to see some 30-30 axons. And then from here, we can bring these into Illustrator or Photoshop and begin to put entourage in, scale figures, silhouettes, trees. I have a bunch of files to share with you that already have some of those already pre-made as vectors. And so I'll put those up for the next time we meet on Canvas in advance, and that way we can look at those later. So one of the other things I wanted to do really quickly for this demonstration is show you guys, I mean, maybe the form of this thing is interesting, maybe it's kind of weird, but I guarantee you, if you start to get inside these things, there are lots of interesting moments, right? What I mean by that is sort of spatial instances inside, where three things line up or don't line up, right? Where you've letting some light in, where you've made an opening, a perfect frame in a particular shape, pointed at a particular place or view, right? So all of these sorts of moments, I want to sort of, I want you to have some tools to sort of walk through the visual or the virtual model. And so instead of thinking about parallel now, I'm going to set the view back to perspective. All right. So here we go back to perspective view. Now, one of the things you might notice about perspective view in Rhino, especially for those of you with a camera, you look at it and you go, it's kind of tight how the perspective view goes, right? And so I'm not selecting anything in my model right now. I selected that ground plane that I made and I deleted it. In perspective view, we don't really need that. We can just use the render settings ground plane. We never see that horizon line. I don't know why we see an axon. It's really annoying. So if I go to over here where it says layers and properties and rendering and those sorts of things, right? There's tabs over here on this right-hand bar. I should have a color wheel, that's the properties. And if I have any geometry selected, it'll give me the properties of that geometry. So this is telling me when I have this wall selected, that's a closed extrusion. I haven't named it anything, so that's blank. What layer it's on the default layer. What the display color is, it's by layer, etc. Right? So sort of tells me about its properties. If I don't have anything selected, it shows me the properties of the scene. In this case, the viewport. So the viewport properties, I'm in perspective mode. Here's the width and height of my viewport. It's in perspective projection. It gives me some camera settings as well, including the lens length, right? And so here for lens length, I'm going to change this, right? 50 millimeter is actually kind of a tight lens. I actually have a 50 millimeter lens with a low f-stop that I play around with. And it's like when you get inside something, like you can only see it, it's like really closing in that viewport window, right? So I want to go with a wider angle, right? So in that case, I'm going to lower my lens length. I could go with 35 millimeter, which is like a sort of typical what do you call it? I can't think of simple words this week, sorry. A typical setting, one of those sort of baselines for camera lenses, if you use a DSLR, or you can go to like something, the human eye is sort of, if you take into account maybe our peripheral vision a bit, is around 28 millimeter estimated. So in other words, I'm going to change that lens length to something smaller, and that gives me a wider angle. So when I'm inside, I can start to see more of the scene that I'm in. I can get inside and start to look up or around and those sorts of things, right?
Josh,
Yeah.
hey, I wanted to ask you, for whatever reason on my camera setting, I can't change the degree like you're just clicking on it and changing it. It doesn't it's like where it says lens length, it's kind of like lightly grayed out. Did you
Okay. Are you still in one of the ortho views or parallel views like isometric?
oh, it has to be in perspective,
You
right?
need it in perspective. Yeah, exactly
Okay,
right.
gotcha.
You'll notice that there's actually, I mean, let's talk about this since this is a representation class. There's perspective and there's 2-point perspective. The difference, of course, is that typically when we draw things at our desk and things like that, we'll say 2-point perspective. But in the just the default perspective mode in Rhino, we actually have a 3-point perspective, kind of like how we would see things in real life. So not only are we projecting an X and Y to vanishing points, but then also in Z, there's a vanishing point, even if it's way, way, way off in space. You'll notice this if you ever go to a big city and you look up at a skyscraper from right up against it, you notice that there's also a third vanishing point, in the Z direction, right? So, and you can see that here, these vertical lines, these vertical edges aren't quite parallel. The vanishing point is just way off into space up in the Z direction. But the key thing, I think, is to sort of think about where I'm at eye level wise, right? Like I put this weird sort of bulkhead here, a sort of false soffit, sort of closing off the space on this side. And so what I'd like for you guys to do is to begin to also try to capture some views on the inside of this thing at some of these moments, some of these really interesting moments. And or you could begin to make modifications to make some of these moments, right? I could look at this and go, oh, it really bugs me that this thing is this so low or not low enough. Maybe this is about compressing me. Or I see something doesn't quite line up, or I need to make an opening. So how do I do that? I'm going to slide this past the other, or move it so they don't quite line up, and then see how light plays around. Right. And then I'm going to also go to my render settings over here. And I'm going to go to lighting. You can just sort of play around with this carefully. But I can turn on the sun. Right. You can see that now the sun starts to give me some crisper shadows. Right. So not only do I have the sky vault sort of give me soft shadows and things like that, like I would, all the reflections off of everything sort of scattering around, right, that diffuse light, but now I have some directional light. I can go to the sun settings. So I turn on the sun over here, go to the settings, and I can manually control the azimuth and altitude here, right? So this gives me the cardinal directions looking down. Like, let's say this would be solar noon because it looks like it's to the south and it's quite high in the sky. So maybe it corresponds closely to, where we are right now, June 21st or close to it, right? That's the solstice, the longest day of the year. It's usually the 20th or 21st, depending on the calendar. Or so I can turn on manual control and begin to play around with those, right? And start to find times where here's where you can have fun, right? We're not working with materials so much, but we are painting with light, right? So if you think about light as a material, and like look at this, it's really interesting. I don't know if you can see my cursor. I'm shaking it so it gets a little larger. You can start to see some of these openings and how they begin to project light in different places and how you can track the time of the day as these things move, right? As this thing gets lower in the sky or higher in the sky, you start to get more light, less light in. Or as it moves across the sky, you might get morning light, and it might get closed off towards the afternoon when you get darker, right? And which is also usually warmer. All right, so I can manually control this, which is just me playing around, like moving a lamp around, right? All willy-nilly. Or I can turn off manual control. I can go down a little bit. I can give it my latitude and my exact location, actually. Well, not exact, but close enough. Las Vegas, right? So that's latitude of 36.175 degrees. Well, that's overly specific. So cool. In case you ever wondered, we're 36 degrees latitude. So if anyone ever asks you that, and say, yeah, 36 degrees latitude, you can always give them this for your location. It could be like your friend texts you and like, where are you at? And you're like 36.175 degrees latitude, and whatever. And they'll look at you like you're a weirdo. Like I totally would look at you like you're a weirdo. Anyway, So we can go to June and maybe June 13th. Let's see here. Today. And we can go to somewhere around 10, sometime between 10 and 11. We can start to see how that morning light works. Then we can actually animate that if we wanted to. There's a way to actually animate the sun if you wanted to look at that and publish a video out. All it does is it snapshots, and then it compiles them into you can compile them into a video yourself if you'd like, using iMovie or whatever, Windows Movie Maker or whatever, QuickTime, right? So you can begin to see how you can play around with these things. And you could actually set some interesting relationships up with the solstices and the equinoxes, right? So I don't know about you guys, but I've always been fascinated with these sort of civilizations that from the past that were that seem to use a different calendar than us, but they were still tracking celestial motions and movements and events, right? And those happened all over the world throughout time, right? And so I think I can think of no better thing to do in the desert, especially, than to sort of really track the sun and begin to think about it, particularly celebrate things like the shortest day of the year, the longest day of the year, and the equinoxes where everything is in balance and sun, rises in the due east and sets in due west, and sort of have half day, half night, etc. Right? So anyway, that's my spiel there, and it's going to directly have an effect on your program and studio. So we'll be doing a museum of sunlight where we're basically just people go to this place to experience particular celestial events and times of the year, to sort of see architecture activated by the sun and lights and shadow, right? So so think about this and think about those key times of the year, right? The December 21st, the June 21st, those are the solstices, right? The equinoxes, March 21st, September 21st, your birthday. I mean, you can have fun with this if you want, right? But think about how you begin to create an architecture that celebrates daily cycles, monthly cycles, seasonal cycles, yearly cycles, right? It's kind of a really interesting thing to try to do. And it's something that we can actually design with, right? And what I like about it is it's a framework by which it's really easy to sort of understand how successful you are or aren't, right? So you can begin to sort of use this as your guiding compass for how you start to make some decisions here, right? All right. So that's in a nutshell. And these are really plain Jane. We don't have any textures. We don't have any perspective, or sorry, any materials. We don't really have too much enclosure. This looks like some sort of outdoor pavilion. You have some weird, outrageous cantilevers that probably wouldn't work. Indoors and outdoors is sort of mixed up, and that's fine, right? One thing I haven't done yet is started to project and draw some lines on the ground, right? So if I look at the ground right now, I can see some shadow lines, right? And if I wanted to start to track some of these things, I could start to actually draw some things on, move them out, the sun into the right spot, and draw some things onto the ground so I can begin to track them, right? Then I can move the sun again and then draw it again and start to map some of these relationships on the ground even, or on the wall surfaces or whatever you want. Floor, ground, wall, threshold, doorway, opening, window, fenestration, however you want to refer to these things, right? I usually try to keep them more abstract. But these surfaces, these planes, right? In order to start to make more sense of these things and start to play around with it. Maybe I start to make material changes later on in some of these key moments, or maybe I just put reveals in them, right? On the ground, on the floor, right? Maybe one of the ways of tracking the sun in this outdoor space is to make my own sort of clock on the ground plane, right? Or maybe it's to line up particular openings with these things. And now I have some line work in the right place. I can turn the sun back on and double check things as I start to slide things around, or make a mass here and then subtract it to create a hole in the surface later on, those sorts of things, right? So trying to get the sort of gears in your brains going, right? You have some latitude to sort of play around with these things, right? You don't have to make architecture that stands up yet and all that other stuff. We'll talk about composition more and more. But to sort of play around with these things, right? I want you to, again, continue playing with this, with these rules of composing planes, rotation in 90 degrees, sliding, and moving and snapping, those sorts of things, right? So I think that's hopeful for you just to develop your skill work, but I think it's also a sort of discipline that you bring to this, so that sort of formal language makes sense without you having to sort of backtrack a bunch, right? I would argue. And what I would say is that you start simple and you can always add complexity, right? You start really complex, then it's like this weird editing mode that you're in continuously. I'd say start simple, make sure that the idea is clear, right? And then you can start to add complexity here and there in the other place, right? So this is being recorded, so you can always refer back to it if you need any quick steps. I'm going to turn it over to you guys very soon here. But I just want to say, like, again, here I could capture out another, do a view pull down capture, right? Or you can just type in capture, I think. And on the Mac side, that's what I would say. Like, start typing in capture and you'll say view capture to file. And that's perfect, right? View capture to file, brings up the same box. I have this thing selected, so I'll deselect that, but I think you get the idea. Yeah, there we go. Right, and I can begin to bring out some quick perspectives here. I'll turn off transparent background, and then I'll get those shadows on the ground again, right? I don't need the grid or the world axes. I want to make sure the viewport perspective is selected. My scale is 1. I'm going to hit OK. If you have a really small viewport and you want to get something that's larger in resolution out of this, here's the way to do it. You can change the scale. So watch what happens when I change the scale. Right now, my viewport is set to 3160 by 1622. And when I do this, those should double, right? So now the resolution that it captures out and sends me will be 6320 by 3244. Now be careful. You go too high. I mean, what happens when I double the width and the height? I get 4 times the amount of information. If I triple it, I get 9 times the amount of information. So you always have the square of what you're doing, the scale factor, as far as the amount of information. And so exponentially, the amount of information grows and your file size starts to grow. So be careful about that. If I change it to scale of 2 and I hit OK, you might actually have to wait a few seconds and watch this command line and wait for the cursor to start to blink. Again, then you'll know that it's done capturing, but it might take it a minute or two because what it's doing, it's generating more information to sort of fill in double the amounts in both directions, X and Y, right? Width and height. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and bring that down to 1 and hit OK. I'll go ahead and export that out just so I have an example in case I need it later. Perspective. 01. Okay. All right. Now, it's not lost on me that there's lots of different ways you could begin to do this exploration. Next week, when we meet up on Wednesday, I'll try to dole out some pads of Bristol paper for you guys. And that way you guys can start to play around. Sometimes it's really easy to sort of push and pull things with paper and model materials. And so I'm going to encourage you guys to do that next week. Right now, I want you to stick in the digital environment and get that nailed. These are the fundamentals. And so, it goes a long way in just sort of learning them. So what am I doing? I'm trying to position myself so that I'm at eye level. So I'm already making a judgment call on the scale of this thing and where, like, let's say an average, somewhere between 5, 6+ foot person, probably their eye would be, and then trying to arrange myself there underneath, right? It's really, I don't want a bunch of perspectives where it looks like I'm in a helicopter hovering over. That's what the isometrics are for, right? But I do want to sort of get inside these things and start to understand them as a human would, right? I mean, most buildings I don't experience by flying over them. I mean, I guess it's a little different in Las Vegas when you're flying out of McCarran. You fly over half of town because the airport's in the middle or sorry, I guess it's a Reed National Airport now, but it's in the middle of town, right? So you do fly over a bunch of stuff. You can see your house and, off in the neighborhood or whatever. But in this case, most of the time you experience things not as floor plans, not as isometrics, not as sections. You get inside, you experience them, right? So, and usually that's at eye level, unless you walk on stilts a lot, which is odd. Don't do that; it's dangerous. Anyway, or maybe that's why you came to Las Vegas. You're the stilt guy. I don't know, whatever. But I've taught people that used to be at the pirate show at Treasure Island, ranked in the top 5 in the world for trampolinists. I mean, I've seen it all here in Las Vegas. It's a pretty awesome place. So, and then they outgrow the trampoline. I guess there's a sort of shelf life and how on athletics in the human body. So then they decide, oh, it's time to turn to architecture or design or something, or landscape architecture, interiors or whatever. All right. So I'm still using the same settings here too, that we created with the sort of blend between the technical drawing and then the soft shadows, and then I turn the sun on, right? So I just assume use that. Later on, we'll talk about creating some shaders carefully and applying those. We'll also talk about bringing these into Photoshop and then starting to create some overlay layers and adding textures that way. So oftentimes when it comes to rendering, like my question, like I always have to ask myself, where do I want to fight battles, right? The rendering mode is really good at like determining accurate shadows. But sometimes like the especially in Rhino render, I wouldn't call it the best rendering engine when it comes to using shaders and things like that. It's not bad, but it's not the greatest. So oftentimes I'll add things in Photoshop or do lots of post-production Photoshop, and you'll have to try to find the balance that you like. I think everybody has their own preferences and along a continuum between what do you render or produce in the CAD environment versus what do you post-produce in Illustrator, Photoshop, or the like. All right. So all right, I am going to stop sharing, but I'm going to go ahead and keep recording. And then let me just turn on my list of participants here. Can I make everybody co-host? Make co-host. Yep. It's annoying. I have to hit OK every time. No, it's not OK. I accidentally went here and hit this button 3 times. Come on. Make co-host. There's got to be a way to. I got to be able to change the settings somewhere and make everybody. Dina, how do I make you withdraw co-host permission? Oh, sorry, I just skipped. Make co-host. There we go. All right. But at this point, I'm kind of curious to see what everybody's been working on. We can just sort of quickly review some things and take a look. I can give you some quick feedback and pointers on some things to continue to develop. So who would like to go first? Don't worry. Contrell wants to go first. Contrell, go ahead and share your screen whenever you're ready. I can't wait to see what Contrell's been doing because he usually takes my expectations and blows them away. All right, here we have 5 different models. Okay, great. So let's take a look.
Can you hear me?
I sure can.
So I used the settings that you emailed us.
Mm-hmm. Oh, great. Yep.
Let me put these on. This is my first one.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of played the relationship between going in and out, searching them, interacting, some of them barely touching.
So you have just a few key vertical surfaces, and the rest are horizontal sort of terraces. They cascade. There's some holes in the slabs, so that you have some multi-story volumes and some really interesting sort of interior volumes, right? I would say volumes rather than just spaces, right? They sort of break with height, right? It's kind of an interesting.
Right. I like different views, but some of them, give me a different feel.
Yep.
Just depends on what I'm trying to go with. That's the first one, though.
So let's just see all 5 of them together. You don't have to keep turning them all on and off. Let's just take a look. So we have a variety. Some are more horizontally oriented, some are more vertical, and some of them are kind of a real nice mix, right? Just sort of half and half, right? So like I look at that center one, and that sort of seems balanced between the horizontal and the vertical more than the others, right?
Right.
Same with that second one. What's interesting about this one, let me get my annotate tools here. I love the idea. It does seem like there's a line here, some sort of axis going in this direction. And then a series of frames or planes that you might pass through, or some sort of thresholds that you pass through along that journey, right? So you might consider precession along an axis, or maybe back and forth along an axis. And then sort of think about how these become the sort of foils for that. Right. And then things going overhead, things underneath, etc. But I see this. Let me just clear this really quickly. I see this opening right here, really pronounced. And then can you go over to this side? I think it continues over there as well. Yeah. Right. So that almost looks like the front elevation of a building. Right. And then I have like, mezzanine floor sort of getting right up close to that glass, or maybe it's a shade, light shelf somehow. Maybe there's a human sort of standing here. Right. And, maybe they can stand over here and start to look down. Right. So to me, I think it's really hard to draw with a mouse, by the way, and so I think, one of the next steps with these is to add that entourage. But first, I want you to get inside and start doing some of those perspectives, trying to find some of those nice moments. So I'd like to see, the perspective from, let's see, someone standing back here on this plane. Yeah. Oh, back here on this plane, looking out this direction. Yeah. So going to perspective and then starting to play around with that, I think could be really interesting. Starting to get inside, turn on the sun, like I said, start playing around. Really nice series though. Can we look at some of the last two in that line? Yeah. So some of these have some closed off interior spaces. Let's look at these two really quickly. Yeah, again, so sort of what's interesting about, okay, let's see, this one is you have some really interesting sort of spatial interlock. So if I looked at like a section through this, right, I have sort of space that does that. I have a space over here that overlooks this one. And I have a space above that also interlocks a bit, right? And so I start to get this sort of multi-story volume here, which I think is really interesting. Trying to shade it in really quickly, right? And then I have a series of trays sort of looking down on top of it, right? So it's I would say, there's planes along the outside. So I'd say maybe at least on when I'm, at least from certain vantage points, it sort of becomes a more introverted scheme, right? Like there's a lot happening in the center that looks like it'd be activated and everything sort of is pointed at, right? Which I think is an interesting idea compared to this one over here where you have the frame. You don't have to move anything, but that frame, back in that the second one over there, where it's a big window wall and we're bringing people up to it looking out, right? And it becomes part of the identity on the outside. So there's lots of different ways to read these things. Can you go to the last one? And the last one's kind of like a layer cake. We have these sort of horizontals, and then we have these sort of interesting sort of top lighting moments, right? Depending on the time of the day, you might get light bouncing down into here and washing across this vertical surface. You might get some going through this slot, and just sort of see where light sort of penetrates in through and from where, right? And if I'm down here, I might get some light that gets somewhere down here, but I don't necessarily see the source of the light, which I think is kind of an interesting thing. I think about that as a really interesting way. We'll look at contemporary architects like Stephen Hall, Tadao Ando, and others, David Adjaye, some others that are really look at light and texture as a really interesting, almost architectural material in itself, right? And so, but I also think about, like, let's say the Baroque, right? So the Baroque was all about creating dynamic lighting situations where you don't even necessarily see where the lighting source is coming from, but then illuminating these sort of really dynamic sculptural geometries and sculptures themselves, and making them, what I mean by dynamic, sort of having a lot of contrast between what's having a lot of light beam down on it and with the shadows underneath, right? So you start to see lots of fluid geometries in Baroque. So that this is not that, but these are planar geometries, but you can sort of get a similar sense, right? How do you begin to sort of play around with lights and hiding that light source with this one? It could be kind of an interesting one, especially if I'm down into the bowels of this thing, down in these sort of spaces here, maybe even back underneath on the ground plane, right? You start to understand maybe where some light actually penetrates, and trying to sort of make those alignments, could correspond to different types of the year, right? All right, anyway, cool. Thanks, Contrell. Perfect. See, that was nice and easy, wasn't it? I didn't yell at anybody. I don't typically yell at people. I don't like conflict, so I'm pretty easy there. I live by the rule, don't be a jerk. Try not to be, anyway. So who wants to go next? Just share what you have. Get some feedback on it. Alex, your mic went on.
Yeah.
So Alex next.
Sign.
Then Dina, you put your hand up, so you'll go after Alex. Sound good? All right.
Sweet. So these are the two compositions I created using the Make2D. So
we're seeing you need to, it's sort of setting like what do you want to share or something like that. Okay, here we go. Oh, perfect. Ooh, look at this. Oh, yeah, we have some coloration. All right.
Yeah. So I was kind of trying to play with the idea of like balconies. I'm realizing now, based off of Control and yours example, I was kind of wasting some of these planar pieces by creating a ground floor, which I don't necessarily need to do. I'm realizing that now, but
well, let's talk about that. I mean, there could be a way. So yeah, we made you think about floor or ground in a different way than you had before, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's good. But B, it could be that, you think about a plinth, right? Like maybe this becomes a strategy, and you show Cantrell a different way than he was thinking about these things, because he's done this before, I think, with me at some point, right? Or seen these before. I will say, I like your corner windows that are sort of cut out from the bottom.
Oh, thank you.
There's an architect in Tucson that I've brought students to visit when we've gone to Tucson. His name is Rob, like Robert Paulus.
Mm-hmm.
But he does these really great windows down at the floor, right? And so it's all about just bringing in some lights without adding a lot of heat gain, because they're in the desert too. They're in the Sonoran Desert, but
right.
Similarly, it's pretty warm. It's pretty darn warm there.
Yeah, I thought this would be a great way to bring in some light. I think that would be pretty interesting.
So I'd like to see you get inside of this and then begin to sort of move some things around, slide them around a little bit.
Sweet. Okay. I think for the ground. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I like how you read those L-shaped pieces that you had, and then you made these sort of things and sort of made these alignments here and here, like I was talking about. So I'd like to see what those look like when I'm next to them, when I'm inside them. Are they openings? Are they opening up a corner? Are they going to be filled in with glass at some point? You never know, right?
Right.
You don't have to make that decision right now, but I'd like to sort of see how light goes through those too, right?
For
sure. And to think about a strategy in which when you don't have these, how do you make them, right? Like, let's say over here, this edge, right? Maybe I want to bring in some light. Maybe I just lift this up. You could always put some pilotis or something underneath it later on, but for right now, maybe it just hangs there, and there's a little gap, and I see, well, what happens when I let light pass in this illuminated thing, right? I think about some other desert architects. Another one that comes to mind is Will Bruder, and he's done this in the past, right? Where you lift that wall up off the floor and let just a light strike that floor and wash across it, right? And so you just get that sort of specular event, and then the reflection, rather than a bunch of heat gain when all the light's penetrating directly into the building, right? So, how light works, right? The light sort of strikes, and then part of its angle of incidence, angle of reflection, right? It bounces away, but the other part turns to heat energy, and that's really bad in the desert, right? So that's why we don't glaze we don't typically use a lot of glass in the desert. We try to shade things in the desert. We try to protect, especially those south and west sides, because that's when the sun gets the nastiest and the hottest parts of the day. So anyway, that's kind of the idea there, right? You might think about how to bring some light in without bringing in all the heat, right? Sort of filtering the light from the heat. Right? So I think that's a really interesting things. You have overhangs like this. So the question I would have is, this dimension right here, and this dimension right here, this setback from this infill panel from the slabs, right? Is it enough, or do you want to inset them in further, right? In order for this, you can think about the desert, or think about shading from the sun in several different ways, right? You can think about horizontal, right? Like the bill of a cap, right?
Yeah.
And that works really well this time of the day, right? This time of the year. But if you think about when you're driving home, you're driving west or something, let's say, or east in the morning time, or west in the evening time, when that sun is close to eye level, no matter how long that hat bill gets, you can't block the damn sun, right? That's when vertical baffles can come in handy, right? When the sun is sort of at more eye level. So that's where this could come in handy to sort of shield, right? Some sort of strategy like this. So you can always play around with that, turning on that sun and starting to see how things look. The other thing I would say is you can always make a copy of this off to the side, and then start to slide things around in perspective, and then you can compare, right? There's got to be some sort of mid-ground. You can't just make things based off of the perspective. Like at some point, you got to bring it back and say, well, this has to also be an envelope, and I can't have a gap here, but I can have a gap here, right? Those sorts of things, and how do I make the proportions work, etc. But you can always sort of go back and forth, and don't be afraid to make copies of things, so that you can always sort of show the progression, right? Again, I'm very interested in the process, right? Ultimately, we're not going to build any of these things, but I am curious about how much you've learned over the course of the summer. So keeping that in mind, right? You can always sort of snapshot this stuff and sort of show your progression, show your process, right? In fact, that could actually be a series of diagrams, right? So you start with this axon, and you slide some things around, you show this one, right? As a sort of snapshotting of the operations you performed. Could be really quite interesting. So I'd encourage you to think about that, right? Make some, as you work in perspective and start sliding some things around, just do it to copies, and then go back into ISO and you can show some of those, some of that progression. I really like that idea. And I would advise everybody, that's why we're doing it in front of everybody. I would advise everybody to sort of think in that sense, right? To me, it's more important that you're internalizing what you're doing and you understand it and you can defend it, right? So that there's a logic behind it. And it doesn't have to be my logic. It doesn't have to be my rationale. Contrell's rationale will be different than Bijan's and probably different than Nate's, right? But ultimately, I sort of want to see what Alex's thought process is and how you're beginning to approach this, right? And then Dina's, and then Nate's, and then Bijan's. Okay, and so, all right, very cool.
Good. Appreciate it.
All right, next. Dina, you ready?
Yes, I just want to let you know I'm kind of sick, 1, and 2, I don't like mine. So
oh, that's all right. Well, let's talk about why. And if you're stuck, let me help you get unstuck. That's my job.
okay, can y'all see it?
Yeah. What's wrong with these?
So
So did you start from left to right, left top to right bottom, or right bottom to left top?
I started from left to right. So left
to right. Okay, I could kind of tell, right? So it's sort of boxier, like you maybe start with bringing things around the periphery and then filling in the inside, and then you start to work your way from inside out, maybe a little more, or thinking about inside out. Yeah, okay. So
the reason I don't like them is because, like, for some reason I can't get my rotate to work on a lot of them. So it's like there's slightly
okay. Select one and let's see.
Okay. Which one should I?
You might have a construction plane turned on and on a plane you don't want, but that's, let's see what we have here. Just pick, I mean, you can pick any surface and we can just sort of see what we really
Okay.
filled up.
Like right here.
Yeah, okay, great. All right, so let's see here. Go ahead. So here's the quickest way to do that. And this is from Control last week. So pick one. And then let me turn on my annotate tool so I can draw on your screen here. So what I want you to do at the top, see where I circled gumball? Go ahead and toggle gumball on.
Okay.
Okay, now if you want to rotate, I have this rotation, right, which goes in this direction, X, Y. I have this rotation, and then I have this rotation. So one's going in this plane, one's going in that plane, and one's going in this plane, right? X, Y, and Z sort of. So let's talk about this. Let me clear that out because there's too much red stuff all over. But let's say we wanted to rotate it. Let's say the bottom edge, we wanted to rotate it this way really quickly. All right. What you would do is you'd click on this blue one because that's just click on this blue arc.
Okay.
Now you see that? Type in 90 degrees. Type in 90 and hit enter on your keyboard. Okay, so now let's say you didn't want to turn it that way. Go ahead and just Command Z it. Let's say you wanted to turn it, here's this vertical face, right? Let's say you wanted to turn it this way, right? Let me just clear the drawings here. So let's find this green one, this green arc. Click on that one.
Okay.
Now hit enter for 90. There, right? So that's one way you could begin to just sort of quickly rotate things in space. And I found that sometimes it's easier because you get those visual cues, like which direction you're swinging. You can always just sort of dolly around if you need to. From there, if it's not lining up, because it does it around the centroid, so not necessarily around a particular point, then you want to snap, let's say, this endpoint to that endpoint or up here, or whatever it is that you're trying to move things into place. Or if you want to freehand it right now, you can always click and drag any of these axes. You can, like the red one will move things up or down. This one, for instance, if you click and drag along that red axis, you just be moving in the Z only. So click and drag it, right? It only lets you move it in one or the other.
Kind of dumb.
So does that help a little bit?
Yes.
Yeah, so thank you, Control, for pointing that out on last week. But the gumball is a big help. And the fact that you can do it with ortho, without ortho, you can do things axially. You can enter in specific values, parameters for like rotation angle, or move distance, etc., or scale factor, right? Similarly, you see this red box and green box, and I think there's a blue box, right? I think those are the scale. So if you click on, let's say, the green or the red or the blue, I think you can scale things in one dimensions. So click and drag. Yeah, sorry. Okay. And you can just move it in just the Y. So if you just need to make a few adjustments, like I need to stretch this to make it a little wider to line up, or it's too wide, I want to get it so that it doesn't extend past the plane that it hits. It just meets the plane that it hits, right? You can take some artistic liberty here, in other words, and start making some design decisions, but tell us about it, right? Say, I did change the kit of parts a little bit, but here's why, and here's what I did, right? And I have no problem with that, right? Again, design, there are no rules to design except that you have to be able to defend it, right? So you have to be able to talk about, well, what did you do and why, right? And then you're comparing that to what the needs are, and that's how something that appears subjective can become somewhat objective, right? So in this case, it could be, I wanted to make another floor, right? This thing is too tall, I need to bring the scale down, or I wanted to make these two things match up perfectly. Again, that architect in me, I want to make order, not disorder. So I needed to make those things touch, right? And where I don't make things touch, then where I break the rules, that's really special. That's that one spot on March 21st where everybody goes to there is a library in Phoenix, speaking of Will Bruder, where everybody goes on the solstice because there is this special light event that happens where all the columns where they meet the roof glow, and it's really kind of crazy, right? So there are examples of that. And then we think about, where I used to live in the Midwest, there was the ancient Adena culture, right? And they made these elaborate mounds, earthworks based off of celestial events, right? We think about Stonehenge, we think about Western and Eastern cultures, right? There's lots of different examples where people were looking at the sky and then making things terrestrial that lined up with things in the sky, right?
Right.
So to me, I think that's the key here. So I actually like, these are near and dear to you. So you're like, I don't like that one. I don't like that one. I like this one, right? And that's great, because it's really easy to say, I'm speaking as a parent, right? You don't like one kid more than the other. But it's really easy to do that with your design proposals, right? You like them, love them all. And what you have to do is you have to be critical of them, in order to sort of understand, well, what's the strongest and what's not the strongest, right? Or what are the two strongest things from each? How do I combine those into the strongest mega idea or something like that, right? So there's lots of different ways. So I like that you're not attached necessarily to one or two of these, in any particular way. That's really healthy attitude to have, when it comes to design, as you probably know, since you're you're landscape architect, trained as landscape architect. But to me, I think that's the key, right? So that gumball will help you out a lot, in sort of making some adjustments. Now you can make adjustments from the top, in perspective and axon view. You can get inside, turn that sun on, and then begin to move things around as well. Rotate things, clear things out, make some openings, close things off, right? Create enclosure, create privacy, create darkness, right? Darkness and lightness, right? Those two things go hand in hand. So, I think you can only appreciate sun and shadows sometimes when you're in a dark space, and there's a lot of contrast, there's a lot of drama with light, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So, I think about monumental spaces. Sometimes they're quite dark. And then, I think like the Pantheon, for instance. You guys know what the Pantheon is in Rome? Right, with the oculus, it's sort of this round dome space, with the coffers, and yeah. So anyway, so yeah, that would be my my one critique here, is just to continue then now with your gumball, your new gumball techniques. Continue doing what you're doing, continue developing, but do some of it from eye level inside. Okay. So you're imagining, you're putting yourself in a space, you're immersing yourself in there. Now you can start to sort of say, well, I want a window this way. I want to close this up. I want a tall space here, right? You can begin to slide things around accordingly and go back and forth. You can go back and forth. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. These are great. After a while, you see enough of these, they all start to look the same. So that's why getting inside the thing becomes really, otherwise they're just objects, right? But not really useful as objects to me, right? To me, it's like, okay, how do we begin to create a sequence of spaces? How those begin to respond to a natural phenomenon like the sun. Okay, so that's the goal here. All right, so we have Nate and Bijan left. Who wants to go next?
Yeah, I don't mind going.
All right,
That's fine.
Nate, how did you do? Well, Bijan's bringing his up. How you had some technical glitches. Are you ready to show some stuff today or not? If not, that's fine. I don't want to put you on the spot.
No, yeah, I am. I'm good.
Okay. All right.
Once I put it on Windows on the new computer, it works just fine.
Okay.
Yep.
Can you guys see this Illustrator file?
Yes, sure can.
So I did view capture the file, and I was able to export this with shadows, the clay rendering, and then I had the thin lines. You make 2D.
Yes.
And then I had the thicker lines, which are the exterior. And I bring this up because I wanted to ask you something on this real quick, and then I'll show you some of the other models. This is just kind of one I just liked.
Yeah.
So when I'm in here and I want to adjust this, like for example, can you guys see my cursor?
Yes.
So this area, this shouldn't be this thick right here. But what happens is when you export those make 2D, it's not perfect, as you said. So you have to make adjustments and add new lines. So I was adding lines with the pen tool, and then they started to connect.
Yep.
So now,
that's the difficult thing with Illustrator.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. You're not wrong. There are ways to split the curve on vertices. I can't remember offhand what that is. But you can also just simply delete it and then draw your own. What I find is sometimes useful. Let me bring up my annotate tool so I can draw. You can't see my cursor. Now you can, hopefully. So sometimes I'll just use that simple line tool and I'll just snap with the smart track on, I'll snap to here, and I'll just start to draw the scene silhouette around. I'll turn all the lines to, what do you call it, 1 or whatever, and then I'll just draw my own silhouette. Like in this case, I probably could. I could just go around and do that pretty easily, you know, and just do this inside, do that inside, do this inside. Or I could just delete this one edge and then just draw it, and then draw that. And then, you know, so that's typically what I end up doing. The other thing is you don't necessarily have, I mean, there's ways to like make Illustrator and constrain it to 30-degree increments when you're drawing stuff. It's not that easy, and I find it's very, like, as soon as I get it to do that, like, and then I want to change it back and just freehand stuff. So what you can always do is you can select, let's say, a line going in that same direction, and copy and paste it, and then just stretch it. You know, and I do that a lot too. Like, you can do the scale, man. But ultimately, you're right. Like, you have to go, but that's why the Make 2D is kind of a weird one. Sometimes you have to go back in and what I call audit the drawing, right? Like you mentioned, fix some of the mistakes or omissions or weird interpretations that it had. Because it interpreted the silhouette to continue that way, right?
Yeah, it connected everything as I was adding on, but it didn't do it everywhere, which is kind of not intuitive.
So I don't necessarily use that pen tool a lot just because of that. The other thing about the pen tool is when I'm like click and click and click trying to make a polyline, if you accidentally click and slightly drag, then you make these sort of curvature handles, and then it suddenly becomes a spline, and it really becomes a pain in the, I mean, it's a royal pain in the rear.
So you copy and paste?
So I try to avoid any drawing I do in Illustrator, honestly. I can share my screen with you and show you.
Okay.
You want me to do that really quickly, and then I'll turn it over to Nate?
Sure.
Let's see. Let me open up Illustrator. That'd probably help.
I thought there might be just an easy way to cut, like, that line, and then have it, you know, delete it, right?
Yeah, I mean, I can't help but not like try to get like something interesting with lights and shadows and going in here though. Like, I just want to play. Oh yeah, look at that. Okay, so now we're getting somewhere. I can't help it. There we go. That's more interesting. Oh, no. All right. Sorry, I'm just waiting on Illustrator to start. There we go. There's Illustrator. Ta-da! Right, so here's an example of an axon that I Make 2D that I brought in from Rhino. So I have layers in Illustrator as well. We haven't talked much about Illustrator, but I plan on doing that the next time we meet.
Are you sharing, Josh?
Oh, I am not sharing. Oh gosh, that's embarrassing. I told that. Okay, here we go. All right, can you guys see now? Okay, so here's Illustrator. I haven't gone over much Illustrator with you guys, and you don't have to worry about that until next time we meet, because we can composite Make 2D stuff if we want, but we can also just bring in your axons and perspectives, and we can start to add scale figures in here with them. So I have some silhouettes and trees and humans and things like that, doing sitting and doing all kinds of running, jogging, cycling, whatever. So yeah, for instance, if I'm missing this line or two, but I have, I'll usually just take the line and do this and just make a line. Or if it's not that clear cut, let's say I'm missing this line and this line as well. Really. What I'll do is I'll copy and paste. I got to use command instead of control. Let's see here. In which case, then I'll select everything. I'll use then the tool where I can select this point, but both points are selected, right? And then I can start to drag and move these things around. If I want to keep that perfect angle, I can go back here and I can just drag the handle and I'll keep that angle, at least for then. I need one that's going in this direction. So just like if I was manually drawing this, you know, I might make some construction lines and they'd extend past each other in a nice architectural way. Then I'd find the intersection, right, and draw that vertical. Then I might go back through and find that intersection, So yeah, I mean, it's kind of a pain in the rear to draw things in Illustrator, isn't it?
But you just don't use the pen tool. You
I
just
don't.
use.
I typically don't, just because
Okay.
it's prone to error. Because here's the pen tool, right? I can make the poly line, but if I accidentally click and drag just a little bit, then I get this weird spline handles, and then suddenly I have curvature I have to deal with, and then I have kinks, and it's just like it gets to be a real mess, right? So and that curvature sometimes follows along, and so yeah. Anyway, I avoid that if I can, which can be annoying
Makes
sometimes.
sense.
If you're doing that and you accidentally put a kink like that in, I believe there's a way to use the other selection arrow.
Just double
You
click.
can, I think you can delete, or I thought maybe you could just delete the handles and straighten those out. I mean, I guess you
It's
could
the-
try to fudge it, but they're still there. I mean, that's why it's a hot mess. Like I'm
It's the
so
anchor
anal about that. I can, yeah,
Josh,
I
it's
mean,
point tool. You got to go back to pen and click the anchor point tool.
okay.
And
Add
then
anchor
you
point, delete
double-click
anchor
it.
point.
Yeah, double click and then it makes it flat again.
Oh,
But yeah,
okay.
but I see
Okay.
it's challenging. Yeah, it's definitely extra steps.
So I'll typically go back through and audit in Rhino sometimes, like where things are on layers. There's a silhouette layer. There's that kind of stuff. You can lock certain layers. It's a lot easier for me to draft things out quickly in Rhino in 30 Axon than it is in Illustrator. So sometimes I'll do the auditing there if I need to. Or there's always this, right? Like you can always just go back and change those pin settings. This is something Miles, right? From Shubin Donaldson.
Yeah.
You know Miles, right? So yeah, I mean he did that workshop and he was showing some of the drawings and he was like, yeah, these are just display mode. We just really tweaked the crap out of the display mode settings in Rhino. And I was like, oh, why didn't I think of that? That's like so much easier than, so yeah, so just learning from others, So but
Cool.
yeah, that's a big time saver, can be a real big time saver sometimes. Okay, let me stop sharing. And then Nate, do you want to go?
Sure.
So while Nate's bringing things up, we're going to be doing a site visit in the afternoon tomorrow in studio. So I have a couple things I need to do in the morning time. Unfortunately, that has to be during this time. So we won't meet for class for 767 tomorrow. We'll meet Thursday. That'll give you guys some time to sort of produce and continue. I think anyway, which will be nice. And then we'll talk about taking it to the next level on Wednesday, adding the entourage. I'll have those examples for you. I'm sorry, on Thursday. Then over the weekend, you guys can finish these things up. Okay.
Can you see my screen?
Yep, sure can. There we go.
Okay.
Sorry,
All right, so no, you're good. So this is one of the drawings. Really just try to use an equal kind of breakout between vertical planes and then
yeah, we
as
have
well as-
XZ, we have YZ, we have XY. Yeah. Yeah, that
So it
one
has-
has kind of a balanced approach.
Yeah, that one's balanced.
This one too, but it has like maybe two massings, right? Like sort of a, like you have something up here. Let me grab my annotate tool. Sorry, you can't see my cursor. I draw sometimes like I think you can, right? So you have this and then you have this in the back, right? Kind of. So interesting. It almost makes me think of like a dwelling, right? Like you have sort of the main living space and you have some sort of like accessory dwelling unit or something off ADU, or that you Airbnb out, or you have like when your mom or grandma or something has to stay with you, and then that's where they or the pool
See
house,
that?
whatever you want to call it. Yeah, okay. So I like the mix. I like what you're doing with the verticals here, right? They seem to be sort of contained around the periphery, and then you have some stuff inside. The verticals here start to cut through some things, which I think is it's different, right? I'm not saying one way is better than the other. And then you have horizontal spaces on one side and horizontal spaces on the other side. Let's take a look at the others really quickly. And that becomes the key, right? When you look at a surface, is it pointing you along a path that you follow? Or is it a barrier, right, between two or three different things? Or is it just the interface between inside outside, right? So there's lots of different ways you can begin to think about how you look at these surfaces. Oh, sorry, I'm just like suddenly like I'm like all of these I just got my flight information to Mumbai. Guess I'll be flying British Air, which is nice. And I have less of a layover. I won't be through Lufthansa and Frankfurt. I'll be in London through British Air. And then I just got that email, and that's somebody. Sorry, like Norfolk. I've never even flown into Norfolk, Virginia, but I guess I will be in August. So, so yeah, I like this one on the left. So let's take a look at this. So again, I'm trying to sort of introduce the language. How do we read these things? How do we talk about them, right? So I do see this sort of really large vertical spine and a lot of things framed out from it, right? Including some more vertical things and a lot of horizontals, right? So I think this is a really strong sort of conceptual model. We can talk about it in terms of the elements of design, the principles of art. We can talk about hierarchy, right? And emphasis, right? The emphasis is on this sort of vertical pier, right? That becomes a major sort of structural thrust that's vertical, and then everything else sort of cantilevers out. And so that becomes the main ordering system there, which I find really quite interesting. Let's talk about those last two. I know it sort of jumps on you. There we go. You're learning the Zoom tools by necessity, probably, really well. So I love the elevations of this one, the one that you were just on, right? Like if you look at the outside view of this, looking that way, like you had it. Can you spin it around a bit so we're looking at the outside again?
Sorry.
You're fine. So here's what happened. You're centering on your. So here's the one to use right here, where you use this sort of select, and then select a little box somewhere over here, where you want to be centered again. When you zoom, with that drag window,
okay,
that window zoom. Now zoom out and zoom in, and you can, when you right click and zoom, or sorry, rotate, it'll be centered around that area again. It's really annoying that it does that sometimes.
Yeah, okay, thank you. That's helpful.
So I like this elevation. I think it's kind of very gestural. It sort of looks helmety, like eye openings and things like that. It looks like windows and glass and planes. I like the fact that there's something projected out in front and there's something behind it and there's something behind it, right? So there's a foreground, midground, background sort of part, and almost feels like at certain places you could infill with glass planes, right? And that they would be nicely shaded because they're way inset underneath these sort of larger sort of volumes. So there's lots of, again, there's no right or wrong. I like all of these, but for different reasons, right? You can find a lot of different things you're doing. And then if you can identify that concept behind it, right? Then you can start to use that concept to help guide you with further development, making more decisions, adding details, etc. So I like those sort of layers of like sort of, you know, here's a plane, there's a plane, right? There's openings underneath, behind those things. You know, there's spaces behind them. But I like that sort of exterior, the way you've handled the exterior here is kind of a really nice. Whether it was on accident, if so, then it was a happy accident, right? But if not, then perfect. All right. So I think getting inside these again, but again, like I've tried to talk about everybody's at least to a certain point part, like, you know, how do you begin to read architecture? I would argue in order to draw architecture, in order to make architecture, you have to sort of be able to look at architecture, understand it, read it, describe it in architectural terms, right? That's what reading precedents are about, and we'll talk about that in studio a little bit. But this idea that there are some key precedents that, you know, you always keep in the back of your head, you know, that one that's all about precession, that one that's about axes, that one that's about the sort of radial configuration, that one that's all about grids, and even not even rectangular or square grids, but triangular grids, right? I remember Just a month or so ago, I was taking students to Washington, D.C. And of course, one of my favorite buildings in Washington, D.C., it's kind of an underrated one, IMP, the East National Gallery. But it's this triangulated waffle. It's really sort of fantastic. And you look at the waffle, I'm talking about the concrete beams underneath the slab that are exposed. Sometimes a waffle looks like literally a waffle, right? Like the coffered sort of feel. But when they're triangulated, then they start to appear like asterisks, right? It's kind of a really lovely sort of pattern. And then these sort of massings come to these really lovely triangulated points, and they're sort of being worn down on the outside because people rub the sort of that razor sharp knife edge of a building edge. So
What
anyway,
was the name of that building?
what's that?
What was the name of that building?
East National Gallery, and it was done by an architect that just passed away a couple of years ago. Very famous one, I.M. Pei, P-E-I. He's a Chinese architect. It's a fun one. I like brutalist sort of stuff. I love photographing it in black and white and grayscale too. It's really kind of gorgeous and lovely in a different light. So we were there to look at some of those things. Yeah, anyway. So let's see, it's 11:10. We have about 5 more minutes. Are there any questions? So for 767, we won't meet tomorrow morning. I'll be meeting you guys in studio in the afternoon at downtown, and we'll talk about that this afternoon, where and when, and figure that out. So Thursday morning, we'll come back. We'll take a look at what you've done with some perspectives and some axons, and be prepared to bring those into Illustrator if you haven't yet. And maybe in some Photoshop, and I'll show you guys different ways. I'll have some silhouettes, people, silhouette trees and shrubs and other entourage, and we can start to place those things and talk about scale. And we can talk about eye level versus the horizon lines when it comes to perspectives, because there's a very particular way you add human scale figures and perspectives in order to make things look right. So, all right. If you have any questions between now and then, just email me. Happy to respond, and if we need to meet up and over Zoom, we can do that quite easily. So, all right.
Thank you, Josh.
Yeah, no, thanks. And I'm like I feel like I'm using a brand new laptop. Like Windows finally just works. Like, so I apologize again for last week. Like I was so thrown off, rattled by like the sort of unending technical glitches, and then suddenly I just fixed it on Friday, and now I'm back up and running, which is good, because it would have been a very long summer if I had to do this without a mouse or even a cursor. Kind of weird way of thinking about it, but yeah, all right, great, good work today. I'm really glad to see it. You guys are coming along, and for Cantrell and Bijan, just so you know, they're also doing the same thing with modeling downtown for their sites. So they've been learning a lot of Rhino and sort of drawing, drafting, extruding, moving, rotating, scale units, that sort of stuff. So now we'll start to map some of that information then onto the digital model. So and start making some diagrams in studio. All right. Okay, great. So I'll see you guys. I'll see a few of you this afternoon and the rest of you Thursday morning. Can't wait. Take care. Till next time.
Thank you.